All right. Romans 10, chapter 10, verses 1 to 9. Confess with your mouth. Confess with your mouth. Well, this does sound familiar. It is in English grammar, that is known as an imperative, meaning it's a command. Confess, obey, not, well, could you please? No. So anyway, have you ever had someone say to you, and this is, I mean, most of what I'm writing in these things has to do with experiences that I've had. Have you ever had someone say to you, oh, it could be a stranger too, by the way, you're a religious person. Will you pray for me? I wonder what he meant by that. Oh, I know what he meant by it saying, will you pray for me, but you're a religious person. What is a religious person anyway? I'm not sure whether I should be offended or happy, because I don't believe in religion.
Well, religion means a way of life. That's all it means, a way. So you're a religious person, yeah, you're living, aren't you? You're religious. Everyone's religious. A drunk is religious.
You religiously drink?
He religiously opens that bottle, you know.
We say that someone is very religious in the way that they save money.
Yeah.
They do it on a regular basis. They're very religious about it. But I'm pretty sure that's not what he was referring to when he asked me, oh, you're a religious person. He didn't know what
He doesn't know where you go, huh?
Well,
You were churchy.
yes.
You're churchy.
I would say that I would be not offended, but I should have been happy, because if a stranger says that to you, then obviously they've observed through you, unless you're walking around with one of those black collars like the priests wear. But if you're just an average Joe, and they knew you for a brief period of time, they may have noticed something in you that made them feel like, if I'm going to ask somebody to pray for me, this is the guy I'm going to ask. Now, there might be other people, but who I've run into, so you can look at it that way. They say that, and I don't have this in here, but they say that religion is man's way of trying to satisfy God. Man's way of trying to satisfy God. That's why there's so many different religions. I mean, back in the old pagan days, they would kill a chicken, or they would do human sacrifices. What are they trying to do? They're trying to appease the gods by sacrificing a life.
Ritualistic behavior.
Yeah, very ritualistic. If the word means that I'm zealous for God every day of my life, then I accept it as a compliment. And I will certainly pray for their salvation. Before Paul's conversion on the road to Damascus, he was extremely what for God?
Zealous.
He was zealous. If you looked up the word zealous in the dictionary, there was a picture of Paul. He was zealous. He was zealous. In fact, he was so zealous that he wanted to he went and asked permission from the chief priest to get together a small little entourage, not an army, but a group of the temple soldiers, and go to any place where he heard there were Christians. And in this case, he was headed for Damascus, Syria, which was not a short trip, but it wasn't. It was what he wanted to do. He was so extremely zealous. So look at, God could have said, Paul, I've seen all these things that you've done, and they're not good. So I don't think I can use you. I think he looked at his zealousness for God. I'm trying to imagine what God would have thought. Well, who knows? He saw something in Paul that he could definitely use. He just needed to take that zealousness and get it on the right track.
Right.
Yeah, that's right.
Because he was on the wrong track.
I just need to face him in the right direction and let him go.
Mm-hmm.
Hence the tone.
Paul called himself what did he call himself?
Sheep of sin.
I'm the worst of the worst.
But considering Pharisees, what did he say?
I'm the Pharisee of Pharisees.
That's right. I am the Pharisee of Pharisees. I'm the best Pharisee around. There's nobody that is more devoted. There's nobody that's more zealous as a Pharisee than I am.
I'm the humblest on the humblest.
Yeah, exactly. Now there were two, and I won't say these are not like our religious parties, political parties, but wouldn't that be interesting? But there were two parties. One were the Pharisees, and the one were the Sadducees. And the Sadducees, believe it or not, were the ones that were in control. The Pharisees kind of like talked louder and made their point, but so there were these two groups, and Paul, and they had differences in belief. The Sadducees did not believe in angels or the afterlife or any of that. The Pharisees did. So they were constantly butting heads.
The people that don't believe in eternal life are the people that are running the church. That's funny.
Always heard
But his zealousness was based on knowledge of the scriptures and obedience to traditions. His zealousness was based on knowledge. He had scriptural knowledge. He knew, and remember now, there was no Bible. All there were scrolls. There would be a scroll of the Isaiah the prophet. There would be a scroll of Jeremiah. There would be and then you had the first 5 books, the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, which were written by Moses. So that's, Genesis, Exodus, and so on. He really didn't have a true knowledge of God. Paul's desire, his heart's desire, was that his brethren, the Israelites, would what? What do you think Paul's great desire was?
His brothers and sisters would be saved.
Yeah, that they would come to know Jesus as their Messiah and be saved. He knew of their zeal for God. But it wasn't based on the knowledge of his righteousness that comes from God. It wasn't based on the knowledge of his righteousness, which comes from God. The righteousness comes from God. It doesn't come from you. You can try to live a righteous life, but you'll never gain the kind of righteousness that's necessary. You may get God's attention, but as far as it preparing you to spend eternity with him, no. Okay, and that's verse 2 and verse 3. And because of that, they didn't submit to God's righteousness, but established their own rules by which they hoped to please God. The reason why Jesus was so upset with the religious leaders, the reason why he was so upset was because their job was to teach the people. Their job was to lead the people in the right direction. And they weren't doing it. They just weren't doing it. So that's why Jesus was so upset with the religious leaders. In reality, he couldn't really be so upset with the people because the people were only living the way they were taught. And those religious leaders had been given authority by God, including the Pharisees, to teach the people. To teach the people what the law had to say. Now there was a time, this is at the same time as Jeremiah was a young boy. There was a young boy, king of Israel, and his name was Josiah. He was like 11 years old. Now, how he could be a king at 11 years old, who knows? But he was zealous for God. And everybody before him and everybody after him were crooked. So, here's Josiah, and one day they're doing some excavation and some repair work on the temple, and they discover some clay cylinders, which is how they would store the papyruses and keep them from being destroyed just by time. And when they opened it up, they took it and they raced it to the king and they said, "We've discovered the law. We've discovered the first 5 books of the Bible. We've discovered Deuteronomy and Leviticus. We've discovered the law." And the king said, after he read some of it, he said, "And worse than that, we haven't been obeying it. It's been stashed away and nobody passed it on like they should have." And so here's Jeremiah that God has sent to say, okay, you got no excuse now. The law is there. Josiah found the law. And what did Josiah do was he got all of Israel to stand kind of like on the steps to the Capitol kind of thing. And Josiah was up at the top. And he read the law to the people. Which is really saying, you have no excuse now. You've heard it. This is what we should have been doing. And he confessed, we have not been doing this. So if we truly want God's blessing, we need to start following this. And of course, a lot of them weren't willing to do it. Because for a lot of them, they were doing things. They were marrying foreign women from other countries. They were doing all kinds of stuff that they shouldn't have been doing. And there were some really tough decisions that had to be made. But the point was, there have always been zealous people in Israel. In the Old Testament, well, before that. But when Jesus came, he fulfilled the law. What does that mean? What does that mean, he fulfilled the law? That means whatever the law was, when Jesus came, he obeyed it perfectly, to the nth degree. He obeyed every bit of the law. Therefore, he brought an end to it. He's going, okay, I'm going to obey the complete law. And so anybody who is in me will not be under the law because I've already obeyed the law. And it allowed the people to be right in God's eyes by simply believing. Just believe. Actually, that's the way it's always been. That's verse 4. This was Paul's message and ours, to present the gospel to all mankind. And we know that the word gospel means good news. You might say it means great news. It takes all of the responsibility out of our hands. In other words, nothing we can do to earn anything. The gospel message doesn't say, and Jesus died on the cross, and you guys helped him. Let me help you, God. I know you need some help. I know you're almighty and all powerful, but I think you really need some help. No, there's nothing. He takes all the responsibility out of our hands and places it in the nail-pierced hands of Jesus. In the Old Testament, Moses teaches his people that they must obey all God's law in order to obtain God's righteousness. That's in Deuteronomy 6:25. They must obey all God's law in order to obtain God's righteousness. This is what was expected of the Israelites when the law was brought down from Mount Sinai. He didn't bring the law down and say, well, I know you're not going to be able to obey it all, but just do your best.
Pick which one.
Yeah, it's not a buffet. This was before Jesus died and was resurrected from the dead, so this is long before that. In order to truly obey, this is in verse 5, that says this, the man who does these things will live by them. If you believe in the gospel, if you believe in what Jesus taught, then that should mean that you're going to live by that, right? You don't say, oh, that's nice, that was in the past, I don't need to really, I know all about that. That's like, what do they say about the people that ignore the past are doomed to repeat it? They look at what happened during World War II or Vietnam, and they go, yeah, we studied that whole thing, and yeah, that was awful and that was terrible. And now let's say we put ourselves in a similar situation, and we just repeat it, even though we should have learned, but we haven't learned anything. But now we live by faith and not by the law. We live by faith and not by the law. Why is that? Because I believe every time somebody gives you a laundry list of things to obey or to do, we feel like if we will, in the case of us, and we get a honey-do list, there's no end to the honey-do list, by the way, you may have figured this out. It just keeps getting longer and longer and longer and longer. But the idea is you have this feeling that if you complete that, then you're okay. If you follow the law, there's always room for improvement. So by living by faith, by believing that Jesus fulfilled the whole law, we don't need to do that, but we need to believe that Jesus is who he said he was and is. There are no works grand enough or strong enough to cause God to accept us and to grant us his righteousness. In other words, we can't say, look, God, I know we haven't talked in a long time, but I'm really doing the very best that I can do. And I hope you grade on a curve and that you're going to give me a pass. because I'm going to do this pilgrimage to the Holy Land or to wherever, Guadalupe or wherever it is that you're going. I'm going to do this, and maybe that'll be like the crowning achievement. And then you'll say, wow, this guy is very serious. So I'm going to grant him the same righteousness, the right living that Jesus himself lives. I'm going to grant that. The most favored nation, I'm going to grant that to this person. And then he says something kind of interesting. This is verse 6 and 7. It talks about going to heaven, and then it says going to Hades. So what Paul is saying is, because boy, that's a hard thing to wrap your head around. The righteousness that we're seeking after from God, we don't need to go to heaven to receive it from Jesus. We don't need to make this pilgrimage to heaven to do that. And then he goes in the reverse and he says, and we don't need to go to Hades to bring Jesus up. In other words, there's nothing that we need to do. It is much simpler than either of these two scenarios. We are told that the truth, is in our hearts and it's in our mouths. In fact, and that's verse 8, in fact, Paul tells us exactly what we can do. Okay, so you don't have to go to heaven, you don't have to go to Hades and try to bring Jesus back up there. There's nothing you can do. Paul says exactly what we do, and this is in verse 9. If you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your hearts that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved.
You will.
Yes, I put a line under the will. It is belief that sets you free. It is your faith that sets you free. Now, you've got to admit that there is a difference between your attitude when you're doing some deeds or some accomplishments to try to gain God's favor. You got to have a certain attitude to do that. It's an attitude that says, I'm not willing to give myself totally to him by believing in him, but I'm willing to do a few things. I'm willing to do this or to do that and cross my T's and dot my I's, but I'm not really this idea of believing in him with my whole heart, soul, mind, and strength. I don't know if I'm really ready to do that. It is your belief that sets you free. Actually, it's always been a faith. Even from the time of Abraham, who was the first Jew. If anybody ever asked you, who was the first Jew? You can say, that was Abraham. His name at the time was Abram. Abram. Yeah, like the tank, the Abraham tank. And then God renamed him Abraham, the father of many nations. When God spoke to him in the desert and announced who he was, who the Lord was, Abraham believed, and it was credited to him as righteousness. It was his belief that, and when it says it was credited to him as righteousness, we would say he was saved. And in the Old Testament terms, when a person And a lot of people say, well, how are the Old Testament saints saved since Jesus had not made his appearance yet? They were made righteous right from the very start with Abraham by simply believing. Because remember how difficult this was for Abraham. His entire family were idol worshippers. In fact, the whole world was worshiping idols. And they were herdsmen, and they traveled from one pasture to another. And when he told his parents, I met God in the desert, and he appeared to me and talked to me, and he told me to leave my father and my mother and go to a place that I will show you. It's like, you're not even telling me where I'm going to go, but he wanted to see what Abram would do. And he just said, okay, that's a huge step of faith. Leaving your family, and family was like number one.
And his faith was tested many times through that with Isaac and everything.
Yep.
But he always measured up, even though he fell short in other times.
In other words, he was made right with God by simply believing. Paul wants all his readers to understand that they cannot earn their justification by works. This is a common thread that goes all through these letters. Because people want to believe they can earn their way. People want to believe that there are things they can do. They can say so many rosaries. They can make pilgrimages. They can do all of these things. And light a mountain of candles. But that justification, to be made just as if you had never sinned, that's a good way to remember what that means. It's a gift of God, so no one can brag. You can't even say, look at me. I obeyed God and look at me now. No. You didn't receive the grace that was necessary, or the faith, by the way, that's also a gift. You can't even say it was by my faith. I have nothing to brag about. There's no bragging allowed. Just like Tom Hanks said, there's no crying in baseball. Well, there's no bragging. There's no bragging about how you got there. It's a gift of God. And that is, and by the way, we were talking about where works enter into this. Ephesians chapter 2, verses 8 and 9 are the ones we're so familiar with. That it's by grace that we've been saved through faith and not of ourselves. It's a gift of God, lest any man should boast. And then in verse 10, it speaks that we are his poema. We are his most treasured creation. Made in the past for good works. He had in the past designed us to do these good things that he had in mind. He didn't say you notice where it's at. It's at the end after he talks about how you're saved. It's not in the beginning. So, Paul presses on. You would think, as good of a preacher as he is, you would think that everybody would have come to him and said, "Wow, that was great. I understand now."
Well, even the apostles sent him off.
Yeah, well, even the people that were there said, "Come back next Sabbath, next Saturday, and tell us some more." And some just said, "You must be drunk. We don't know. We just don't buy this. We're so entrenched in our rules and regulations that we can't." In other words, like, you're the false teacher here. And we don't buy into it. So not even, and look at Jesus himself. He's on the earth. He's preaching to all these people, and some walked away. Some walked away after they saw miracles, and they heard his teaching, and he spoke like one with authority, and yet people still walked away. So it's not.
Well, look at the thing of he heals this guy that's never walked, and all the Pharisees can do is say, you did it on the Sabbath.
Right.
You broke the Sabbath. It's like, wait, what?
You're trying to lessen them.
He's not supposed to be carrying his bed.
Yeah,
Right.
he should be carrying.
Why are you carrying this bed?
Why are you doing miracles?